The Vakith Empire had a word for what they did to planets like Earth. The word was *Kethavar*. It translated loosely as the quieting. Not destruction. Destruction implied the target had done something worth a real response. The quieting was something simpler. It was the act of pressing your thumb over a candle flame. Brief, clean, efficient. The flame goes out. The world continues, but under new ownership. Admiral Soravell had performed Kethavar 42 times in his career. He was a tall being by Vakith standards, long-limbed and gray-skinned, with the four-fingered hands and wide amber eyes that his species had evolved over millions of years on a world with poor light and long winters. He stood at the observation deck of the Eternal Dominion, flagship of the Third Expansion Fleet, and looked at the pale blue dot hanging in the center of his display screen. Earth. From this distance, just past the outer edge of the human solar system, it looked exactly like the survey files had described it. Small, quiet, sitting alone in a very large amount of dark space. He had looked at 42 worlds from roughly this distance, and every one of them had looked the same. Small, temporary, about to become something different. The fleet spread out behind and around him for nearly 10,000 kilometers, 600 warships. It was the largest single deployment the Vakith military had made in 60 years. Not because Earth required 600 ships. The strategic analysis had concluded that 150 would be more than enough, but because the High Council wanted to make a point. 600 ships made a point that words could not. 600 ships said, "Look at what has come for you. Look carefully, and then ask yourself whether the next few hours go easier or harder." It had worked on 217 worlds. Not a single one had refused twice after the demonstration. Soravell pulled up the intelligence file on the human species. He had read it many times over the past few months, but review was a habit he maintained. Details looked different once you were actually doing the thing rather than planning it. The file was thick. The way files on young species always were. Young civilizations were messy and didn't fit neatly into the standard categories. The humans had faster-than-light travel, jump-based, primitive by Vakith standards. Their ships shook during transit, and the crews took physical damage if they pushed too hard or jumped too far. The medical files the survey drones had captured from human hospital records described a condition called jump sickness, vomiting, disorientation, temporary blindness in severe cases. Their navigational accuracy fell off sharply with distance. Their ships were small. Their heaviest warships were roughly a quarter the mass of the Eternal Dominion. Their weapons were primarily kinetic, dense metal rounds accelerated to high velocity. Some energy-based systems mixed in, but not sophisticated ones. Their shielding technology was functional but rated thin by comparison to Vakith military grade. They could hurt ships that came close, but they could not project firepower to any meaningful range. Their fleet was divided between 4 separate governments. This was the critical detail. The humans called their governments the Earth Union, the Pacific Collective, the Atlantic Alliance, and the Colonial Sovereignty. 4 separate militaries, 4 separate chains of command, 4 different communication protocols. Within living human memory, these governments had been in open armed conflict with each other. They had signed a mutual defense treaty 14 years ago, but the treaty had never been tested. In practice, a coordinated response to an outside threat would require all 4 command structures to agree on a course of action, agree on who was in charge, and communicate clearly with each other. In Soravell's experience, that kind of agreement took time he would not give them. The one detail in the file that had always given him faint pause was the conflict history. 14,000 documented wars in 2,000 years, not skirmishes, not raids, actual wars, organized, sustained, escalating campaigns of violence that humans directed at other humans again and again and again, getting better at it with every generation. They had built weapons capable of sterilizing their entire planet. Twice. 2 separate programs. two separate arsenals aimed at each other across political lines. And they had not fired. The Vakith analysts who wrote the behavioral section called this a failure of will, a species too chaotic and divided to follow through on its own threats. Soravell had read that conclusion, and he had agreed with it, because it was logical and because the evidence supported it, and because agreeing with it led to a clean strategic picture. He set the file aside. "Dresch," he said, "report." Tactical Officer Dresch moved away from his station. He was young, 20 years younger than Soravell, and precise in the way that good tactical officers were precise. He gave you what you needed in the right order and didn't waste your time with what you already knew. 42 human vessels in orbital configurations around the planet and its primary moon. Standard patrol spacing. No unusual movement since we crossed into the system. The inner moon has 2 surface installations, both catalogued as mining and research facilities. 11 commercial stations in the asteroid belt. Outer system colonies are quiet and running normal operations. And us. They've detected the fleet, sir. Soravell looked up from the display. At this rain. We estimated 11 minutes for the fleet's transit signature to appear on their instruments. It was 4 minutes. Their long-range sensor network is more developed than our survey data indicated. The survey data is 6 years old in some sectors. Dresch kept his expression neutral. No change in their fleet posture, no scramble, no launch activity. They see us and they haven't moved. Discipline or shock, Soravell said. He had seen both. Begin the broadcast. The surrender terms went out on all human frequencies simultaneously. The automated translation system handled delivery, Soravell's rank signature attached, the terms identical to those offered to 217 worlds before this one. The humans would retain their planet. They would retain their governments, their culture, their social structures. They would pay tribute at a level set by the Empire's productive capacity assessment of their world. They would open their mineral resources to supervised extraction. They would contribute labor to approved imperial programs on a rotating basis. They would survive. They would continue. They would simply no longer govern themselves. It was, by any reasonable standard, a generous offer. While the broadcast ran, Soravell looked at the display. The inner moon of Earth rotated slowly in the tactical projection, a gray-white sphere, smaller than the planet, partially developed. The survey data listed the surface installations as mining infrastructure and a small scientific outpost. There was a permanent human population of approximately 6,000 on its surface. Something about the moon's sensor readings was not quite right. He frowned at the display. Dresch, what's the power output reading on the lunar installations? Dresch checked his station, checked again. Elevated, sir, above baseline for the listed operations. By how much? A pause, a longer pause than it should have taken. Significantly above, sir, and the signature is structured. I'm seeing regular intervals in the power draw. Another pause. This is not consistent with mining or scientific operation. Something is running a cyclic power demand, repeatedly and rapidly. Before Soravell could respond to that, the sensor board lit up. Not one new contact, not a handful. The board began updating in continuous bursts, the system pulling new contacts out of the background noise of the solar system and flagging them faster than the classification system could process. The asteroid belt, which the survey had mapped as containing 11 commercial stations and a great deal of rock and ice, was changing. The rocks were moving, not the slow, orbital drift of natural objects or the lazy motion of mining ships. Fast, coordinated movement in formed patterns. Things that had been sitting cold and still in the shadows of asteroids, sitting there long enough to look exactly like rock to a passing survey drone, were waking up. Their drives came online one by one. Their sensor profiles resolved from debris to something that had no good name in the Vakith tactical database. An Earth's orbital shell, mapped by the survey as containing 42 known ships and a network of civilian communication satellites, was not what the survey had said it was. Cold objects were activating. Things the sensor system had been reading as nothing, minimal thermal signature, minimal power, minimal radar return, were coming online. Not in a single ring around the planet. Not in 2 rings. 3 separate concentric shells of activating contacts, each ring containing dozens of signatures that the system was still trying to classify and could not, because the shapes and power profiles did not match anything in the Vakith military database. The count on the display climbed. 400 active contacts, 700, 1100, 1400. The system was still searching, still pulling new things out of the background. The lunar surface opened. What the survey drones had catalogued as a long natural ridge on the moon's southern hemisphere split apart in sections. The pieces drew back like shutters opening, and what was underneath was not rock. It was metal, an installation of considerable size, a magnetic acceleration rail running for hundreds of kilometers across the moon's surface, pointed at a calculated angle toward the space the fleet occupied. The power draw from it was immense and still building. The sensor system tried to classify it, and returned a result that made Soravel read the line twice. Mass driver, planetary scale, output velocity, significant fraction of light speed. A transmission came in on a tight beam signal aimed directly at the Eternal Dominion's command frequency. Not broadcast to the system. Aimed. With precision that said the sender knew exactly which ship was in command and exactly where it was. The translator rendered it in standard Vakith. A voice, female, calm in a way that was not the calm of bravado. It was the calm of someone who had been waiting a long time for a specific moment and was now, without drama, simply in that moment. Vakith Expansion Fleet. This is Admiral Chen of the Earth Unified Defense Command. We received your terms. Our answer is no. You entered our solar system at 0914 by our reckoning. In approximately 14 minutes from that time, this solar system will be clear of your vessels. We suggest you use that time to record any final messages you wish to send to your families. This transmission will not be repeated. The signal ended. Dresch reported his count. 3,412 active weapons installations across the solar system, and the sensor board was still updating, still finding more. 600 ships. 3,412. And a countdown had appeared in the corner of the tactical display, pushed to the fleet's command frequency, human origin, precise to the second. 1347. 1346. 1345. Soravel stood at the display and said nothing for a moment. He was a professional, and professionals did not lose composure at tactical displays, regardless of what the displays said. He had 40 years in this fleet. He would not break now. He thought about the file. He thought about 14,000 wars. He thought about a species that had built weapons capable of ending all life on its planet and pointed them at itself. He thought about the phrase the analysts had used, failure of will. And he thought about the question that phrase had answered without anyone asking the right question to begin with. The analysts had asked, why didn't they fire those weapons at each other? Nobody had asked, what did building those weapons teach them? Nobody had asked what 40 centuries of war did to the species doing the fighting. Nobody had asked what they got better at. Nobody had asked what happened to a species when it finally, for the first time, had a common enemy. The asteroid belt fired. It was not a salvo. A salvo had a beginning and an end. What came from the belt was continuous, dense metal rounds moving at velocities his sensor team was still calculating, because the numbers kept growing and they kept needing to recheck them. The rounds moved in precise arcs that threaded through the fleet's formation, each arc targeted to a specific vessel, and the targeting was so exact, so impossibly exact, that it could only mean one thing. Whatever was shooting had perfect positional data on all 600 of his ships. It had known where they all were before the battle started. The first impacts came simultaneously. 12 ships went dark at the same moment, not clustered, not in a single section of the formation that could be explained by targeting a specific area. 12 ships distributed across 3,000 kilometers of the fleet, chosen, it seemed, to demonstrate that no part of the formation was safe, that the targeting could reach anywhere, at any time, against any ship. The brilliant expansion. The 7th reached glory, the Keth's own honor. 9 others whose names Soravel read on the casualty board with the steady focus of a man deciding how to feel about information later. Then the moon base fired. The round it launched was the largest single kinetic projectile Soravel had ever seen outside of a planetary defense station. It moved down a line of ships that had been drifting together in the confusion of the first seconds of contact, drawn together. He realized, by the gaps the satellite network had pushed them toward, guided without knowing it into the geometry that the shot required. 11 ships gone. 23 ships in the first 45 seconds of contact. The counter read 13:02. Soravel stared at the blue dot. He had been reading the wrong page of the file for 30 years. Everyone had. The conflict history wasn't a warning sign about a species too chaotic to be a threat. It was a training record. It was the log of 10,000 years of a civilization getting better, generation by generation, at the one thing that mattered right now. Dresh, he said, and his voice was still steady, still professional, because he was a Vakith admiral and he would not be otherwise. Full shields, all ships, maximum evasive dispersion. Get me a line to high command. Sir, Dresh's voice was very careful. Our long-range communication antenna has already been targeted. We cannot achieve a clean transmission window for approximately 16 minutes. 16 minutes. The counter read 12:58. Soravel turned back to the window and the pale blue dot that had stopped looking like a candle flame. The command center was carved into solid granite, 2 kilometers beneath a mountain range in a part of the world that officially did not have a military installation anywhere near it. It had taken 11 years to build. 3,000 workers, all of them vetted, all of them sworn, all of them paid from budget lines that did not officially exist. The ceiling was raw rock. The floor was poured concrete. The air smelled like recycled oxygen and machine oil and the particular dry cold of underground places that never saw sunlight. There were no windows. There were no decorations. There were 400 workstations arranged in concentric rings around a central platform, and on that platform stood Admiral Laihua Chen. She was 53 years old. Her hair was cut short and had gone fully white sometime in her mid-40s, which she attributed to this job and the particular kind of stress that came with knowing things that no one outside this room was allowed to know. She had been a fighter pilot before she was an admiral. Before that, a student of military history. She had spent 15 years reading about every war humanity had ever fought, which had made her exactly the right person to understand what the survey data meant when it arrived 30 years ago. The survey data that arrived 30 years ago said, in plain terms, that something with faster-than-light travel had parked silent drones in Earth's solar system and was watching. Something that did not say hello. In Admiral Chen's professional opinion, something with faster-than-light travel that parked surveillance drones around your home and did not say hello had intentions that were not friendly. She had said this at the emergency closed session of all 4 planetary governments, in a room where 11 people knew the full situation, and every one of them had signed documents acknowledging they understood what would happen if they told anyone else. It had taken 4 hours for all 4 governments to agree. That was the only time in recorded history all 4 governments had agreed on anything in 4 hours. They called it the Pale Blue Dot Protocol. The name came from an old photograph, one of the oldest photographs humanity had of itself from space. A picture taken from beyond the edge of the solar system, showing Earth as a tiny speck of pale blue light in an enormous dark. A scientist named Sagan had looked at that photograph and said, in words that had been repeated for generations, that on that dot, every human who had ever lived had played out their life. Every war, every empire, every moment of genius and cruelty and love. Admiral Chen had chosen the name because she wanted everyone who worked in this facility to remember what they were defending. Not a government, not a flag, a dot. Their dot, the only one they had. The protocol had 3 phases. Phase 1 was concealment. For 30 years, the world's 4 militaries had been building things in the dark, not with any one government's full knowledge. The protocol was deliberately compartmentalized, run through a joint command structure that sat above the 4 national militaries and answered only to the closed council that had created it. Things were built in the asteroid belt, disguised as commercial mining operations. The equipment moved slowly over years, so that the drone surveys recording the solar system's activity would see nothing unusual. Just mining, just routine expansion. The installations in the belt were railguns. Big ones, cold running most of the time, powered down to the absolute minimum needed to keep the targeting systems warm, their power signatures buried under the legitimate operations around them. There were 47 of them. Each one had been positioned through years of careful calculation to give overlapping fields of fire across the inner solar system. The moon had taken longer. The mass driver that ran across the southern hemisphere had been built in sections, disguised as a survey and mining project, its true purpose hidden in budget documents under headings that described it as a long-range ore transport system. Which was not entirely a lie. It could transport ore. It could also accelerate a 200-ton metal slug to 7% of light speed and put it through a target the size of a warship at a range of 500,000 kilometers. Earth's orbital shells had been the hardest part. 3 rings of weapons platforms, each one individually small enough to pass as a dormant satellite, each one cold running on minimal power, each one equipped with thermal dispersal systems that made it look, to any sensor system scanning from the outside, like a dead piece of space junk. There were 612 of them. They had been placed over the course of 15 years, launched from various countries under various cover stories, drifting quietly into their assigned positions, and then going cold and still and patient. Phase 2 was activation. A single encrypted signal broadcast on a frequency the survey drones could not detect would bring everything online simultaneously. The railguns in the belt, the mass driver on the moon, the orbital platforms, and the fleet. The fleet was the piece that nobody outside the closed council knew about at all. It had been built in the outer solar system, in the dark beyond Neptune, where no commercial traffic went and no survey drone had reason to look. Assembled from components manufactured in dozens of separate facilities across Earth and its colonies, shipped piece by piece on cargo vessels whose manifests described them as carrying agricultural equipment and industrial machinery. 318 warships, each one built around a drive system that had been developed in a black site research program for 22 years. Not a jump drive, not the shaking, blood-and-vomit technology that the publicly known human fleet used. Something better, something much better. Phase 3 was the counterattack. And Phase 3 was what the counter on Admiral Chen's display was currently counting toward. She stood on the central platform and watched her operators work, and she was calm in a way that surprised even her. She had spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment, and now that it was here, the fear she had expected to feel had not arrived. What was there instead was something closer to focus. Clean, cold, absolute focus. "Ma'am," said Commander Park, her tactical lead, from his position at the central ring. "Vakith fleet has fully materialized. 600 vessels confirmed. Formation designated as receiving line configuration. They've begun broadcasting their surrender terms on all our frequencies. I heard, Chen said, she had. Their translation software had been working on Vakith language for 27 years, since the first drone communications had been intercepted and decoded. She had listened to the surrender terms in a calm, automated voice while her operators brought the protocol to full readiness. It was, she thought, a generous offer by the standards of conquest. The humans would survive. Their planet would continue. They would just stop being free. She had read the Sagan photograph's caption many times. She had read the speech that went with it. On that pale blue dot in the dark, there was no cavalry coming. There was no one who would ride to humanity's rescue. There was only what they built for themselves and whether they had built enough. Oracle is locked and reporting ready, Park said. Oracle was the targeting and coordination system, 35 years of development. An artificial intelligence built on the combined military knowledge of every war humanity had ever fought, running on a distributed computing network that had no single physical location. Oracle had been fed the position of every Vakith vessel the moment they materialized. It had been calculating firing solutions before the fleet finished dropping out of transit. It had assigned every one of the 600 enemy ships to a specific installation, allocated ammunition loads, computed approach vectors, and pre-calculated targeting updates for every possible evasive maneuver the Vakith fleet might attempt. It had done all of this in approximately 4 seconds. All installations are confirming ready status. Belt batteries nominal. Luna driver nominal. Orbital shells, all 612 are active and locked. And the fleet. Long-range confirmation from Commander Vasquez. All 318 ships are running hot and ready. Chen nodded. She had one transmission to send before she pressed the activation key. She composed it carefully. Not angry, not proud, just clear. She wanted the Vakith admiral and whoever was listening beyond them to understand what was happening. Not a fight born of desperation. Not a lucky resistance that might not hold. An answer. A clear, intentional, pre-planned answer, delivered by people who had known this was coming for 30 years and had spent every one of those years getting ready. She transmitted. She listened to her own words go out on the tight beam, aimed at the Vakith command ship. Then she pressed the activation key. The counter started. For the first 3 seconds, nothing appeared to change. Then Operator Ewan at the sensor station to Chen's left said, "Belt batteries 1 through 12 are firing. Continuous fire full rate." He paused. "Impact confirmation coming in. We have 12 simultaneous strikes, all confirmed." Chen watched the tactical board. The Vakith fleet was enormous on the display, 600 ships drawn as small white points, their formation stretching across thousands of kilometers. 12 of those points went red simultaneously. The red meant the ship was out of the fight. Red meant it was over for that vessel. The belt batteries had been cold and silent for years. They were cold no longer. "Luna driver is charging," said a different operator, "firing in 7 seconds." The mass driver on the moon's surface built its charge in a sound that no one in the command center could hear, but that the remote cameras on the lunar surface showed as a physical phenomenon, the air around the launch rail shimmering with static discharge. 7 seconds. 6. 5. It fired. The targeting system had spent the last 4 minutes calculating where the Vakith ships would be. Not where they were when the calculation started. Where they would be. The round crossed the distance in just over 2 seconds and entered the formation at the exact point where 11 ships had drifted together, drawn there by their attempts to navigate the satellite network they were trying to use as cover. 11 more red points on the board. "Orbital shells are engaging," Park reported. "All rings active, multiple target engagements across the formation." Chen looked at the board. The Vakith fleet had entered her solar system 600 ships strong. In the first 45 seconds of contact, they had lost 23. That was just the opening. Oracle was running. It was updating targeting solutions in real time, processing the sensor data from every installation simultaneously, adjusting for the Vakith ship's movement, predicting their evasive patterns based on the behavioral data gathered from 30 years of drone observation of Vakith military exercises in their own space. It knew how they maneuvered under fire. It knew the response times built into their command structure. It knew the formation shapes they defaulted to when surprised, and the rally patterns they used when trying to regroup. It knew because humanity had been watching them for exactly as long as they had been watching humanity. They're attempting to form a defensive cluster, Park reported. 4 groups inter-system facing. Tell Oracle, Chen said. Oracle already has it, Yuan replied. Firing solutions updated. Belt batteries 7 through 19 are reorienting. The cluster formations, groups of Vakith ships pulling together to share overlapping shield coverage, made sense against an enemy that was firing in directed salvos. Against an enemy that had 47 separate firing platforms spread across the asteroid belt, plus 612 orbital installations, plus a lunar mass driver. Clustering meant putting more targets inside every overlapping field of fire. Oracle had been waiting for them to cluster. Ma'am, said Park, we have a Vakith broadcast on their general fleet frequency. Their fleet is being ordered to retreat to the outer system. Chen looked at the board. The counter read 1123, show me the vector. Park overlaid the projected retreat line on the display. It ran outward from the inner solar system, angling away from Earth and toward the outer planets. The retreating ships would need to cross the asteroid belt to reach meaningful open space. Chen looked at the 47 belt batteries that had not yet fired at full capacity. She almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Maintain targeting priority as assigned, she said, and open a channel to Commander Vasquez. Vasquez's voice came back from the outer system with a 5-second transmission delay, the speed of light, undefeatable, a reminder of how big space was even within a single solar system. Vasquez here, Admiral. 318 ships, all systems nominal, waiting on your word. Chen watched the retreat vector on the board. Stand by, she said. They're coming to you. She turned back to the tactical display. The counter read 10:47. The belt batteries were still firing. The orbital shells were cycling through their target lists with the mechanical patience of machines that had been cold and waiting for a very long time and were now, finally, doing the thing they were built for. In the asteroid belt, 47 installations that had spent years pretending to be mining equipment were firing as fast as their magnetic rails could cycle. And the counter kept counting down. It did not care about the outcome. It had been set before the battle started. It would reach 0 regardless. The only question was how many red points there were on the board when it did. Tactical Officer Dresch had always considered himself calm under pressure. He had graduated at the top of his class at the Vakith Naval Academy. He had served on 3 ships before earning his current post. He had been in 2 previous engagements, a short conflict with a species called the Murath in the far outer reaches of the Empire's expansion zone, and a suppression action against a minor rebellion in the 6th Reach. In both cases, he had performed his duties without panic. He had done his job. He was doing his job now. The job was getting very difficult. Status on Group 7, he said, keeping his voice at the professional level he had practiced. Not loud, not strained, controlled. The operator at communications checked again. Group 7 is not responding, sir. Keep trying. He moved to the next station. Group 7 was 12 ships. They had pulled into a defensive cluster formation 4 minutes ago when the first retreat order came down from Admiral Soravel. Clustering was standard doctrine under massed incoming fire ships sharing overlapping shield coverage, presenting a hardened face to the threat. It was the right move against conventional weapons in conventional engagements. Dresch had watched Group 7's cluster form on his display with a feeling he was carefully not nomming. The cluster had drawn together, the 12 ships moving into tight formation. Then the targeting from the asteroid belt had shifted, multiple firing platforms reorienting simultaneously. The tracking system couldn't immediately follow all of them. Then the cluster had taken 19 simultaneous impacts across its formation, and Group 7 had gone from 12 ships to 4 in approximately 8 seconds. The 4 survivors were now scattered and running for open space in different directions. Oracle, the humans called their targeting system. Dresch had picked up that word from intercepted communications. He didn't know exactly what Oracle was, but he understood what it did. It saw everything. It adjusted for everything. Every move the fleet made, the targeting adjusted. Every formation they tried, the firing arcs shifted to exploit it. Every standard doctrine they applied, something on the other side had clearly anticipated it. The engagement felt less like a battle, and more like being taken apart by a machine that had spent years thinking about how to take them apart. Which, Dresch was beginning to understand, was exactly what it was. The display in front of him was a landscape of red points. Out of 600 ships that had entered the solar system 70 minutes ago, 70 minutes that felt like 70 years, 111 were now confirmed destroyed. Another 40 were dark, meaning their communications were out and their status was unknown. Another 63 were reporting various levels of damage. The intact combat-capable force was down to approximately 386 ships, and that number was changing every few seconds as the belt batteries continued to cycle. The asteroid belt was the worst of it. The initial shock of the engagement, the lunar mass driver, the orbital platforms, the first salvos, those had been terrible. But a Vokoth fleet was not helpless. They had shields. They had point defense systems. They had redundant communications and trained crews who knew how to function under fire. They could absorb punishment and adapt. What they could not adapt to was the belt. The 47 installations, and that number itself had come as a shock, because the survey data had listed 11 commercial stations in the asteroid belt, 11, and what they were now dealing with was clearly not commercial, fired continuously. Not in timed salvos. Continuously. The rounds were dense metal, accelerated to velocities that overwhelmed point defense systems not because they were fast, but because there were too many of them, coming from too many directions. Point defense was designed to handle incoming fire from a limited number of vectors. Against 47 separate firing platforms spread across a 300 million kilometer arc, the math simply did not work. Every ship in the fleet was currently running on maximum shield power. The shields were absorbing what they could. They were not absorbing enough. Sir, Operator Kell at the sensor station was one of the best sensor operators in the fleet. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when their owner has decided that staying steady is the only useful thing they can do. I'm reading new signatures. Outer system. New contacts. Yes, sir, they don't match any human vessel profile in our database. She worked her station. They appear to be coming from the direction of the outer planet system, vector toward current fleet position. A pause. Sir, there are a lot of them. Dresch crossed to her station. He looked at what she was showing him. 318 contacts. Moving fast. Drive signatures that were not the primitive jump-based technology the survey data had described. These were smooth, continuous burn signatures, indicating a propulsion system that was nothing like the shaking, unreliable drives the human fleet was supposed to have. The contacts were running at acceleration rates that the survey data said human ships could not achieve. Those aren't the same ships as the patrol fleet, Dresch said. No, sir. Their drive system is different. Yes, sir, significantly different. Dresch stood at the sensor station and let himself absorb the information, because he was a professional and he did not have the luxury of not absorbing it. There was a human fleet, a separate fleet, a fleet of 318 ships that had been sitting in the outer solar system, cold, dark, hidden, waiting, running a drive technology that the survey data had not flagged as existing. Because the survey data hadn't known it existed. Because it was not something the humans had shown anyone. Because they had built it in the dark and kept it in the dark and never once given the drones anything to look at. The word that came to Dresh's mind was the Vocath word for an ambush prepared so thoroughly that the ambushed party cannot claim they had any warning to miss. There was a specific word for that in the old tactical language. It translated as the patient trap. "Sir," Kell said, "our retreat vector, the course Admiral Soravel ordered for the outer system." "I see it," Dresh said. The retreat vector ran directly toward the incoming fleet. They had ordered the ships to run, and the ships were running directly toward a human fleet that had been positioned where they were running to, which meant the humans had known, or correctly predicted, that the standard Vocath response to being hit from the inner system was to run for the outer system, which meant they had placed a fleet there, waiting for the Vocath fleet to come to them. Dresh got on the command channel. "Admiral, new contacts, outer system, 318 vessels, unknown drive type, our retreat vector." "I see them," Soravel's voice came back. He sounded like himself. That helped somehow. "Abort the retreat order, all ships full stop, hold current position and fight facing inward. We are not running into a second engagement." "Yes, sir," Dresh relayed the abort. Ships began correcting their courses. Some of them were already too close to the belt, already inside the range where the belt batteries could engage at maximum efficiency. Dresh watched those ships on his board and did his job and did not think about the specific ships in that position. "I need a count on our current effective strength," Soravel said. "Working on it, Admiral." The count was difficult because the number kept changing, but Dresh ran the numbers as best he could, ship by ship, status board by status board. Ships confirmed destroyed, 132. Ships dark and likely lost, 51. Ships with major damage that had reduced their combat capability, 78. Ships combat effective, approximately 339. 339 from 600. In under 9 minutes. Dresh reported the numbers to Soravel in the same steady professional voice he had been using since the battle started. He was proud of that voice. He intended to keep using it. "Understood," Soravel said. "Nothing else, nothing more." Dresh returned to the tactical board and kept working. He noted, without allowing himself to stop and fully think about what it meant, that the Vocath fleet had not received any communication from the outer edge of the system. Standard doctrine said that when an expansion fleet entered a new system, a communication drone was released at the system's edge to relay status back to the nearest Vocath base. The drone had been released. It had been traveling since the battle started. At its transmission speed, it would reach the base in approximately 3 days. But from inside the solar system, the fleet could not reach high command with any signal faster than light, and the nearest Vocath base was 11 light minutes away. Any signal they sent right now would not be received for 11 minutes. Any response would not arrive for another 11, 22 minutes of delay per exchange. The counter the humans had planted on their command frequency read 849. High command would not know this was happening until it was over. A new alert on Dresh's board. He looked at it. Then he looked at it again. "Sir," he said. "Report." "I'm reading hull breach signals from the following ships." He listed them. 6 vessels. The hull breach signals were coming from the ship's emergency beacons, not their communication systems, which meant their communication systems were gone and only the emergency hardware was still running. Their positions correspond to the area of engagement near the asteroid belt's inner edge. He paused. "One of the beacons is transmitting crew survival data. It's reading." He ran the number. 14% crew survival. Soravel said nothing for 3 seconds. Understood. 14%. On a standard Vokoth warship of that class, 14% was 68 crew members out of 478. The war had been running for 9 minutes. Dresh watched the outer system contacts closing. 318 human ships, running in a spread formation that was different from anything in the Vokoth tactical manual. Not a line, not a wedge, not a standard attack formation at all. It was something he had no category for, something that positioned each ship at an independent angle to the others, overlapping fields of fire in a three-dimensional lattice that would make it extremely difficult to target the formation's core without exposing yourself to fire from multiple flanking directions simultaneously. He did not know the human tactical term for this formation. He suspected it had been developed specifically for this battle, specifically against Vokoth standard doctrine. He suspected they had been developing it for 30 years. "Sir," said Kel, "I'm reading a broadcast from the outer planet, general frequency." She paused. "It's not human." Dresh turned. "What?" "The source is the 6th planet, the gas giant. There's a facility there, not in any of our data." She worked her instruments. "I'm getting a broadcast signature consistent with a trading vessel. Sir, there's a Cathori ship there." The Cathori were neutral. They were traders, diplomats, and Dresh had always suspected intelligence gatherers. They had a presence on the edges of most star systems that had anything worth trading with. Apparently Earth's solar system had not been an exception. They had been watching from the gas giant's orbital shadow, keeping their distance, keeping their silence. Until now. "What are they broadcasting?" Dresh asked. Kel listened. The translation took a moment. "They're broadcasting to the Galactic Trading Network, an event report." She looked up. "Sir, they're describing this battle in real time. They're transmitting a full account to every network node they can reach. Every species in the network. Every government. Every fleet. Every emperor and council and republic that maintained a receiver on the galactic trading channels. They were all watching this now." Dresh thought about that for a moment. He thought about what they were watching. 600 Vokoth warships, the largest expansion deployment in 60 years, being methodically taken apart in a solar system that was supposed to belong to a primitive, divided species barely capable of spaceflight. "Sir," Kel said, "the human outer fleet is entering engagement range." The counter read 7-14. On the tactical display, 318 human warships opened fire simultaneously. Dresh did his job. He kept his voice steady. He tracked his boards and reported his numbers and did not allow himself to name what it was he was watching. But later, if he was asked, he would say that the worst part was not the weapons. The weapons could be quantified. The weapons were metal and energy and physics, and those things had numbers attached to them, and numbers could be processed. The worst part was the coordination. Every installation, every ship, every firing platform moved as a single thing. They responded to fleet movements before the movements were complete. They hit the most dangerous ships first, every time with no hesitation, no recalibration delay. It was as though everything in the entire solar system was connected to one mind, and that mind had nothing to do but this. Nothing to worry about but this. It had been thinking about this for 30 years, and thinking time was something it had used extremely well. The Vokoth had a word for the quieting. Dresh was very much afraid the humans had a different word for a different thing. And he suspected the two words were about to meet. The High Council of the Vokoth Empire met in a circular chamber at the top of the administrative spire on the imperial homeworld of Vokoth Prime. The chamber had a glass ceiling, and through it, if you looked up, you could see the planet's 2 moons hanging in an orange sky. The chamber had been used for decisions for 3,000 years. Wars had been declared here. Civilizations had been absorbed here. The lines of 100-star charts had been redrawn in this room by people who sat in the same chairs that the current council occupied. High Counselor Veth, the council's chief executive, the one who had authorized the Third Expansion Fleet's mission to Earth, sat in the primary seat and looked at the battle feed on the display in front of him. There was a 4-minute communication delay between the Vakith fleet's position in Earth's solar system and the nearest relay station, and another delay of varying length from the relay station to the homeworld. What Veth was seeing was not happening now. It had happened 11 minutes ago. The ships going dark on his display had gone dark 11 minutes before he saw it happen. He kept reminding himself of this, because the numbers on the board were very bad, and the delay helped him believe they might have improved. They had not improved. The feed showed the Third Expansion Fleet in serious difficulty. The losses were beyond anything his strategic advisors had described as possible for an engagement of this type. The fleet had entered the human solar system, a solar system belonging to a species that could not project power beyond its own neighborhood, and in the first few minutes of contact, it had lost more than a fifth of its ships. The losses were ongoing. His military advisor, Fleet General Oren, had been on his feet for the last 10 minutes, moving between display screens with the tight, rapid movements of a being trying to find a piece of information that would explain what he was seeing in a way that made sense. It was not making sense. "Walk me through the installation count again," Veth said. Oren turned. He was an old soldier, older than Veth, older than anyone else in the room, and old soldiers were supposed to have seen enough to keep their bearing in a crisis. Oren's bearing was intact. His eyes were not. "Our relay has confirmed 3,412 active weapons installations inside the solar system. That number is likely low. The sensor systems were still finding new contacts when the last data package was transmitted." 3,000. "Yes, sir." "Against 600 ships." "Yes, sir." The room was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a council chamber in a normal session, where people were thinking or waiting for the right moment to speak. This was the quiet of people who were watching something they didn't have words for yet. "The lunar installation," Veth said. "Explain that to me." Oren pulled up the relevant data. "It's a mass driver, a magnetic acceleration rail. The length and power output put it in a class that we have no equivalent of outside our home system defense network." He paused. To build something like that on a moon, disguised as a mining operation over the course of multiple years, the engineering discipline involved, the coordination, the information control necessary to keep it hidden from our survey drones, it is not a simple undertaking. Yet they did it. They did it. Oren set down the data. "Our survey drones were last physically updated 4 years ago. We relied on passive observation for the more recent data. Whatever they built in the last 4 years, we have limited visibility on. But the lunar installation is older than 4 years. The size of it, we estimate it took at minimum 8 to 10 years to build." Veth absorbed that, 8 to 10 years, building a planetary-scale weapon while pretending to mine ore, and no one noticed. "Our drones were looking for military signatures, sir. Standard power levels associated with weapons development. The humans ran the installation at below threshold power for most of its construction. The power demand only becomes detectable when it's in active use. They knew what our drones were watching for." Oren took a moment. "Yes, that is the inference." The display updated. The battle feed had caught up by another transmission window, more red points on the board. The count of Vakith vessels lost had climbed past 200. Veth looked at the number for a long time. Then a secondary alert appeared on the display. It was not from the battle feed. It was from the Empire's Colonial Alert Network, a system that flagged unusual events in systems adjacent to Vakith-controlled space. Multiple alerts, not one, not two. "What are these?" Veth said. Oren crossed to the secondary board. He read the alerts. He read them twice. Then he turned to face the High Counselor with the same steady professionalism he had maintained throughout the meeting, and he said, in a careful voice, "Sir, we are receiving reports of unknown vessel contacts in 6 separate systems along our outer colonial perimeter. Unknown vessels, not matching any profile in our database. Approximately 300 vessels in total distributed across the 6 systems. They have not fired on civilian targets. They appear to be targeting our military installations, communication relays, supply depots, naval stations." The room was quiet again. Veth counted the implications of that sentence one by one. 300 unknown vessels, in Vakith space, already there. Not approaching from Earth's solar system, there had not been enough time for ships to travel from Earth's system to the outer colonies since the battle started. These vessels had already been in position, waiting. "They've had ships in our space," Veth said. "That is the inference, sir, positioned prior to this engagement. The timing of their activation corresponds almost exactly to the moment our fleet crossed into the human solar system." Oren kept his voice level. "They were activated when we committed to the attack, not before, not after, at the moment we crossed the boundary." Someone on the council, Veth did not look to see who, said something under their breath in the old language. The old language had words for moments like this that the modern language didn't. Words that described the specific feeling of realizing that a plan had failed in a way that was not a misfortune, but a design. That someone had built the failure into the plan before the plan began. "How long have they been in our space?" Veth asked. Oren consulted the data. The positioning of the vessels, based on the trajectories we're seeing, suggests deployment over a period of years, possibly as long as 20 years. 20 years. For 20 years, human ships, unknown drive type, unknown design, not matching anything the survey drones had recorded, had been sitting in the outer edges of Vakith colonial space. Cold, dark, patient, waiting. "What are they doing to the installations?" Veth asked. "Disabling them primarily. Communication relays are being powered down. Our technicians are reporting interference consistent with targeted electromagnetic pulse systems. Supply depots are being bypassed or put on emergency lockdown by the attacking vessels. The naval stations," Oren checked. 2 naval stations have been destroyed. The others have been disabled." A pause. "They are not attacking civilian infrastructure, sir. They are specifically targeting military capability. They're not trying to conquer. No, they are trying to ensure we cannot mount a military response." Veth sat with that for a moment. Then the Kethori broadcast came in on the council chamber's network feed. A trade channel transmission, widely broadcast, the kind of signal that went to every receiver in the network simultaneously. Veth read the header and understood what it was before he listened to it. A Kethori vessel, presumably the one that had been lurking near Earth's solar system watching the engagement, was broadcasting a full account of the battle to the Galactic Trade Network. To everyone. He listened to a portion of the broadcast. The Kethori vessel was describing the battle in the precise, factual tones that Kethori traders used for commercial bulletins. The number of ships destroyed, the number of weapons installations, the coordination of the human response, the timeline. They were the most widely connected trading species in the region. Their broadcast network reached 62 separate governments, including every species that currently existed in some subordinate relationship to the Vakith Empire. 62 governments were reading about this battle right now. 62 governments were learning that 600 Vakith warships had entered a solar system and were being disassembled by a species that the Vakith's own files classified as pre-imperial and primitive. Veth turned back to the battle feed. The losses were past 220 ships now, more than a third of the fleet. The surviving ships were maintaining a defensive posture in the middle of the inner solar system, caught between the belt batteries on one side and the incoming human secondary fleet on the other. The secondary fleet, the 318 vessels that had come from the outer planet region, was now fully engaged with the Vakith formation. Veth had been watching battles on displays for his entire career. He knew what a battle in trouble looked like. He knew the patterns of a fleet under pressure, the way ships clustered, the gaps that opened in formations, the frantic movement of vessels trying to find a covered position that didn't exist. He knew what a battle in its final phase looked like. "Can the fleet retreat?" he asked. Oren shook his head slowly. The asteroid belt blocks the primary retreat vector. The secondary vector toward the outer system runs through the approaching human fleet. The inner system, toward the planet, is covered by the orbital shell installations. The fleet is effectively, he chose the word carefully, bounded. Bounded. There was a reason the Vakith Empire had a word for the quieting. It worked because it was applied to worlds that had nowhere to run to. Worlds that were bounded by the reality of the fleet above them, with no ally coming and no exit available. The quieting worked because it was applied from a position of absolute geometric advantage. Veth looked at the display and understood, with the clarity of a very bad moment, that the humans had done exactly that to his fleet. They had studied the Vakith. They had mapped the Empire's territory while the Empire was mapping theirs. They had positioned ships inside the Empire's space. They had built weapons in their own system while keeping the power signatures below the thresholds that the survey drones would flag. They had designed a battle geometry that bounded a fleet twice the size of their own. They had done all of it quietly, patiently, over 30 years, while fighting 14,000 wars with each other. While somehow the analysts had called it a failure of will, not destroying themselves with their own worst weapons. Veth thought about that phrase now, failure of will. He thought about what it actually meant for a species to build weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, point them at each other, and not fire. He thought about what kind of will that actually required. Not the will to destroy. Any species could find that. The Vakith had found it. Most species, when sufficiently threatened, found it without much difficulty. What the humans had demonstrated, in keeping those weapons unfired for decades, in building instead, in cooperating across 4 hostile governments to construct the largest pre-planned defensive system ever attempted, was something different. Restraint, applied strategically, over decades, against the most powerful impulse their species possessed. That was not a failure of will. That was will of a kind Veth had never encountered before. On the display, the counter that the humans had placed on the fleet's command frequency read 433. Veth looked at Fleet General Oren. "Send the recall signal." Oren paused. "Sir, the fleet is." "I know what the fleet is. Send the recall signal. Formally and on record, I am recalling the 3rd expansion fleet from the human solar system." Veth folded his hands on the table in front of him. "And send a communication, standard diplomatic channel, to the humans. I want to open a direct line." The council chamber was very quiet. Through the glass ceiling, the 2 moons of Vakith Prime hung in the orange sky, right where they had always been, unchanged. Everything else was changing. Veth watched the counter descend toward 400, and he thought about the fact that the humans had set it before the battle started. They had known when it would end. They had built the ending before the beginning had begun. He found, sitting in the same chair that 3,000 years of Vakith rulers had occupied before him, that he did not have a word for what he was feeling. The old language might have won. He wasn't sure he wanted to know it. The counter read 112. Admiral Saravel stood at the observation deck of the Eternal Dominion, which was now the only ship in his fleet's central position that had not been destroyed, disabled, or ordered into retreat. Around him in the dark, the wreckage of what had been the 3rd expansion fleet drifted in expanding clouds of metal and heat. His display showed 41 ships still responsive to fleet communications. out of 600. 41. The human secondary fleet had pulled back 10 minutes ago, not away from the engagement zone, sideways, into a surrounding ring that kept every surviving Vokoth ship inside a neat circle of fire. They had stopped shooting. They were waiting. Dresch was at his station, running damage reports on the Eternal Dominion itself. The flagship had taken 3 significant impacts, 2 from the belt batteries, 1 from a pair of human warships that had come in close enough for a direct engagement. Its shields were at 31%. 2 of its 4 main drive units were offline. It was not going anywhere quickly. "Sir," Dresch said, and his voice was still controlled, still professional, though Saravel could hear the strain underneath it now, the strain of a being who had been holding the professional voice in place through the last 14 minutes by sheer discipline and was not going to let it go now at the end, no matter what. "We're receiving a transmission. Human. Direct channel." The same voice. "Yes, sir." Saravel nodded, put it through. Admiral Chen's voice filled the command deck. The translator ran it in clear Vokoth. "Vokoth Fleet Commander, I'm addressing you directly because I believe you are still the senior officer of your force and because I believe you are a professional who understands the current situation accurately." A brief pause. "You have 41 vessels responsive. We have surrounded them. You cannot retreat through the belt and you cannot retreat toward the outer system without engaging our secondary fleet." Another pause longer. "We are offering terms. Full ceasefire. All surviving vessels will power down weapons systems and primary drives and hold position. No further hostile action will be taken against your ships or your crews. Your wounded will receive medical support if you request it. Your surviving vessels will be given a departure corridor and escorted to the edge of our solar system." The counter read 0:47. "You have 60 seconds to respond. After 60 seconds, we will resume the engagement until your force is fully disabled. We do not want to do that, but we will." The channel remained open. Saravel looked at the display. 41 ships. Approximately 22,000 crew members across the fleet, though many of those ships had taken casualties. The number of survivors who were alive right now, sealed in whatever intact compartments remained, waiting to find out what happened next, he couldn't calculate it exactly. But it was not 0. There were people alive on those 41 ships who would or would not continue to be alive depending on what he said in the next 50 seconds. He thought about the High Council. He thought about the 217 worlds. He thought about 42 ceremonies of the quieting and the absolute certainty he had carried into this system. The certainty that had felt as solid as anything he had ever known, that this was going to be number 43. He thought about the pale blue dot. He thought about a species that had spent 10,000 years getting better at exactly this, all without knowing they were practicing for exactly this, all while their analysts called the fighting a failure of will. He thought about what 30 years of patient preparation looked like from the inside, what it required, what kind of people chose it. He thought about a voice saying, "In approximately 14 minutes, this solar system will be clear of your vessels." Not a boast, not a threat, a statement of fact delivered before the fact occurred. "We have calculated this. We have built this. We know how it ends and we are telling you in advance." "Open a channel," Saravel said. Dresch opened it. "Admiral Chen." Saravel spoke in his own language and let the translator carry it. "This is Admiral Saravel of the Vokoth 3rd Expansion Fleet. I accept your terms. All surviving vessels will comply immediately." He looked at Dresch. "Fleet-wide, all ships power down weapons and primary drives, comply with human instructions." Dresch relayed the order without a word. The counter reached 0:00. And then it disappeared from the display. Its purpose served. The thing it had been counting toward having arrived exactly when it said it would. The belt batteries went quiet. The orbital platform stopped cycling. The human secondary fleet held its positions, surrounding the scattered remains of the 3rd Expansion Fleet in a ring, watching without firing. The lunar mass driver's power reading fell from its operational peak to zero in a smooth, controlled descent. A machine powering down rather than a weapon going cold. The difference between something that had done its job and something that had simply been stopped. The silence that came after was enormous. Not peaceful. Silence in space was never peaceful. It was just the absence of violence, which was not the same thing. But the guns had stopped, and 41 ships were still on the board, and the beings on those ships were still alive to receive the human escort vessels that were already detaching from the secondary fleet and moving toward them. Soravel stood at the observation deck for a long time. He had no way of knowing, from where he stood, what was happening elsewhere. He had no way of knowing that two of the Vakith Empire's subject races, species, that had been paying tribute for decades, and had been described as content in the last Imperial Stability Report, had begun armed uprisings on their home planets within 2 hours of the Kethori broadcast reaching their governments. He had no way of knowing that the Kethori trading representative on Vakith Prime had submitted a formal request for a meeting with the High Council, carrying a message from 17 neutral governments who wanted to establish a line of communication with Earth. He had no way of knowing that High Counselor Veth had sent a recall signal and a diplomatic inquiry to the humans at almost the same moment Soravel had accepted the ceasefire terms. He did not know any of that. He stood at the window and he watched the human escort vessels approach his surviving fleet, and he waited. The escort vessel that matched course with the Eternal Dominion was smaller than any Vakith military ship. A compact, functional design that spoke to engineering priorities rather than aesthetics. A human officer aboard it opened a communication channel, identified herself, and in careful but accurate Vakith, offered to provide medical support to any crew members requiring it. Soravel accepted. He met the human medical team in one of the Eternal Dominion's secondary airlocks, 6 humans in sealed suits, carrying equipment he didn't recognize. They were smaller than he was, most of them, though he had reviewed the biological files often enough that the size didn't surprise him. What surprised him was something that the files had not adequately described, which was the way humans moved when they were inside a damaged alien warship, aware of everything, heads moving, nodding details, assessing. Not afraid, but not casual either, something in between that he didn't have a word for. The lead medic was a young woman, 30 perhaps by human standards, dark hair, brown eyes, a small scar on her left jaw that the standard Vakith healing technology would have removed in minutes, but that she was apparently carrying deliberately. She looked at Soravel for a moment, professionally and without malice, and then she said in practiced Vakith, "Can you show me to where your injured crew are?" He showed her. Walking through the ship's corridors while the human medical team followed him, he found himself watching her the way she was watching him, trying to understand the specifics of a species he had read about in files for years and was now, for the first time, actually encountering. She was calm in a way that was not cold. That distinction felt important. He had met calm species before. The Murath were calm, the Arithka were calm in their own way, but calm usually looked like control, like suppression, like something underneath being kept still. This was different. She moved through a damaged alien warship toward a corridor full of alien injured, and she was calm in the way that someone is calm when they know exactly what they are doing, when they have done things hard enough for long enough that the hard thing in front of them is not frightening. It is just the next thing to do. They had been doing hard things for a very long time. At one point, passing through a stretch of corridor where the damage from the second impact was visible, a long scar in the ceiling, metal torn and cooled, emergency repair foam still curring in the gaps, she paused and looked at it. Not with sympathy, just looking, assessing the way everything she did was an assessment. "Your ship took 3 hits, she said, not a question. "Yes." "Your shields held on the first 2. "Yes." She nodded, filed the information away somewhere, and kept walking. He wanted to ask her something. He held it for 3 more corridors and then said, the preparation, the 30 years of construction, the installed weapons, the fleet in the outer system. He searched for the right question because there were too many questions and only one of them was the real one. When did you know we were coming? She glanced at him sideways. When your drones arrived. 30 years ago. Yes. And in those 30 years, you built all of this. Yes. He considered that. Your 4 governments, they agreed to build all of this together. It took 4 hours to get everyone in agreement, she said. After that it was mostly a matter of engineering. 4 hours, he said. The 3rd expansion fleet had taken 8 years to plan and authorize and assemble. We're good at agreeing when the thing we're deciding about is important enough. She stopped at the entrance to the medical bay, where the first of the Vakith wounded were visible through the corridor window. She turned to face him fully. You thought all our fighting meant we couldn't cooperate. It was not a question, but he answered it honestly. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly. The way you look at someone who has made a logical mistake and you understand why they made it and you don't hold it against them. All that fighting meant we knew how, we'd had practice, we knew what war looked like from the inside, we knew what it cost, and we knew that when something came for us from outside, she paused, it would matter more than any fight we'd had with each other. She pushed open the medical bay door and walked in. In the weeks that followed, the galactic community reacted the way galactic communities always react to something they have no existing category for, slowly, with great caution, and in many different directions at once. The Kethori established diplomatic contact with Earth within 72 hours of the battle's end. 17 other governments followed within the month. 2 of the Vakith Empire's subject races filed formal requests for autonomy negotiations, citing the changed strategic situation. The High Council, for the first time in 3,000 years, entered into diplomatic talks with a species it had designated for the quieting. The conversation was, by all accounts, very different from those the Council usually had. Admiral Chen, when asked by her own government what Earth's terms would be in those negotiations, gave a list that surprised almost everyone. She did not ask for territory. She did not ask for tribute. She did not ask for a subject relationship or a guarantee of future military advantage. She asked for 3 things: a formal recognition of sovereignty for every world the Empire had absorbed, an end to the Empire's expansion program, and an open diplomatic channel that all parties could use. When the negotiating team asked her why those 3 things and not more, she said, "Because we're not them." She said it without anger, without pride particularly, just as a fact. We are not them. The weapons platforms returned to their cold, dark positions in the weeks following the battle. The orbital shells powered down and resumed their postures as dormant objects in the black. The belt batteries cooled and waited. The mass driver on the moon's surface closed its panels, and from outside, the long ridge looked like natural rock again. The fleet, 318 ships that no external intelligence service had known existed, pulled back to the outer system and settled into their holding positions, cold and patient, waiting for the signal that might or might not ever come again. Earth's 4 governments made no announcement about any of it. They issued a brief joint statement, acknowledging that a Vakith fleet had entered the solar system and departed following negotiations. They released no technical information, no weapon specifications, no details about the fleet in the outer system or the installations in the belt or the driver on the moon. The message they did send, the one that Admiral Chen composed herself and transmitted on the same frequency the broadcast network used, was shorter. Less than 100 words in the compressed transmission format. It said, "We are here. We have always been here. We will continue to be here. We do not seek to expand. We do not seek to conquer. We ask only to be left in peace. We have demonstrated, we hope, that we are capable of ensuring that peace ourselves. It said, we are the species that spent 10,000 years learning how to fight, and then spent 30 years learning when not to. It said, if anyone has questions, we are willing to talk. Attached to the transmission, in a format that every major species on the network could read, was the complete historical record of humanity's wars. Every one of them. From the first documented conflict 10,000 years ago to the last recorded engagement between two human governments 14 years before the battle. Every war, every weapon, every cost, every treaty. The full record of everything it had taken for humanity to be what it was. Not as a boast, as a warning, and as an explanation. On the far side of the solar system, beyond the orbit of Neptune, one of the 318 ships of the Dark Fleet ran a brief systems check and then powered back down to its waiting state. Cold, patient, invisible. Above the blue dot, the stars were the same as they had always been. The dot turned slowly on its axis in the dark. It had learned over 10,000 years that the dark was not empty. It was ready. It had always been ready. It would wait.